The last time I stood in front of Lighthouse Cottage, I was holding the keys in one hand and my husband's ashes in the other, whispering promises to the wind about the life we'd planned to build there. Tonight, I walked through the vaulted entrance of the seaside and wearing the diamond earrings Marcus bought me on our last anniversary, the ones I'd pawned and bought back twice over the past 3 years. The banner stretched across the grand ballroom read, "Congratulations, Victoria. Welcome home," in elegant script above a slideshow of my sister posing in front of white clapboard siding and blue shutters I'd chosen, on the wraparound porch I'd designed, under the decorative lighthouse beacon that was supposed to be my memorial to the man I loved. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The room smelled like expensive catering and entitled laughter. Inside, crystal champagne flutes caught the light from chandeliers I'd never be able to afford. Women in cocktail dresses admired the professionally printed photo book of Victoria's supposed renovation journey, a journey that erased me from every page. I stood just outside the double doors, watching my reflection in the polished glass. Same dark hair Marcus used to tuck behind my ear. Same green eyes that used to light up when we drive past that property, making plans, dreaming out loud. I reached into my purse and pulled out the folder. Not yellowed with age like some forgotten relic, but crisp, fresh from the county recorder's office. Inside were copies of documents that told a very different story than the one my sister had been telling for 3 years. Property deeds with signatures that didn't quite match. Transfer documents dated during the week of Marcus's funeral when I couldn't tell you what day it was, let alone what I was signing. Witness signatures from people who'd later claim under oath they'd never seen those papers before in their lives. I hadn't come to make a scene. That would be too easy, too forgettable. No, I came because silence had protected her long enough. Because every lie she told about my instability, my grief-induced confusion, my inability to handle my own affairs had been swallowed whole by a family that found it easier to believe I was broken than to admit one of their own was a thief. Because 3 years ago, she'd stood in my living room 2 days after we buried Marcus and said with tears in her eyes that she just wanted to help, that I shouldn't have to deal with all this legal paperwork alone. That family takes care of family. Well, I was about to show everyone exactly how family had taken care of me. The string quartet inside shifted to something classical and upbeat. My cue. I slid the folder back into my purse, straightened my shoulders, and pushed through the doors. Heads turned like dominoes falling. Conversations stuttered and died mid-sentence. Wine glasses paused halfway to lips painted in shades of pink and red that matched the rose centerpieces on every table. And there, at the center of it all, standing beside a 3-tier cake decorated with an edible image of Lighthouse Cottage, was Victoria. She wore white because of course she did. A flowing sundress that probably cost more than I'd made in a month at any of the 3 jobs I'd worked these past 3 years. Her smile was wide and practiced, the same smile she perfected in every family photo where she stood just slightly in front of everyone else. That smile fractured the instant our eyes met. For just a moment, just a flash, I saw fear flicker across her face before she managed to rearrange it into shocked concern. People were still staring, the kind of staring that happens when a ghost walks into a party thrown by the living. There was a time when Victoria and I were inseparable. Growing up in Ashford, we were the Brooks sisters and everyone knew us. She was 2 years older, the bold one who always knew what she wanted and how to get it. I was the dreamer, the one who preferred sketchpads to student council, sunset walks on Cascade Bay to debate team competitions. Our parents ran Brooks & Associates, the most prestigious law firm between Portland and the coast. Dad specialized in estate planning, Mom in family law. The irony wouldn't become clear until much later. Victoria followed them into law naturally, effortlessly. By the time I graduated high school, she already had internships lined up, recommendation letters from judges, a path so clear it might as well have been paved in gold. I went to art school instead, much to Dad's barely concealed disappointment. But Victoria was always there with a hand on my shoulder at family dinners when the questions got too pointed about my future, when Dad would make comments about practical careers and Mom would sigh about wasted potential. She'd change the subject, redirect attention, play the role of protective older sister so well I never questioned whether it was genuine or performance. I met Marcus at a gallery opening in Portland during my junior year. He was a carpenter who'd built the display frames, staying late to make sure everything was level, secure, perfect. He had sawdust in his hair and calluses on his hands, and when he smiled at my paintings, really looked at them, I felt seen in a way I'd never experienced in my own family's living room. We were married within 2 years. Small ceremony on the beach, just us and a handful of friends. Victoria was my maid of honor. She cried during the vows, hugged me so tight I could barely breathe, and whispered that she was so happy I'd found someone who got me. My parents came but left early. Dad had a client dinner. Mom had a headache. Typical. But Victoria stayed until the end, dancing with Marcus's brother, laughing with our friends, playing the part of the supportive sister so convincingly I never saw the resentment brewing underneath. Marcus and I rented a tiny apartment above a bookstore in Northeast Portland. He built custom furniture during the day, while I worked at a nonprofit arts education program that paid almost nothing but felt like it mattered. We were broke and happy, the kind of happy that doesn't need much. But we had one shared dream that kept us going through thin months and broken down cars and student loan payments that never seemed to shrink. The Lighthouse Cottage on Mercer Point Road. We'd drive out to Ashford on weekends, park across from that property, and just stare at it. The house was a disaster when we first saw it. Peeling paint, rotted porch boards, windows so grimy you couldn't see through them. But the bones were solid and the location was perfect. Perched on a cliff overlooking Cascade Bay with the decorative lighthouse beacon that hadn't worked in decades. Marcus would sketch renovation plans on napkins at diners. I'd paint watercolors of what it could look like. White clapboard siding. Blue shutters the color of the ocean on clear days. A wraparound porch where we could watch storms roll in. A studio space for me in the converted lighthouse. A workshop for him in the old boat shed. It became more than a house. It became the symbol of everything we were building together. When the property finally went up for sale, we'd been married for 5 years. We had some savings, not much, but Marcus had been doing well with his custom furniture business and I'd started selling paintings at a few local galleries. We knew we couldn't afford it outright, but Marcus's uncle was a loan officer and we'd been pre-approved for a mortgage that would stretch us thin but not break us. We made an offer. It was accepted. We were supposed to close in 6 weeks. Marcus wanted to start renovations immediately, work on it every weekend, turn it into our home before we officially moved in. He'd already ordered materials, drawn up detailed plans, scheduled time off work. We drove out there on a Saturday morning in October, parked in the gravel driveway that was now legally ours, and Marcus handed me a bottle of champagne he'd been hiding in the truck bed. We toasted to new beginnings on that broken porch, laughing about how much work it needed, how perfect it was going to be. That was the last good day. For days later, Marcus was gone. A drunk driver ran a red light downtown. Marcus was on his motorcycle, heading home from a job site. He died before the ambulance arrived. They told me he didn't suffer, that it was instant, like that was supposed to make it hurt less. The world became a blur after that. I remember snapshots, disconnected moments that felt like they were happening to someone else. The hospital room with fluorescent lights that made everything look greenish and wrong. The funeral with too many flowers and not enough air. The lawyer reading Marcus's will in a voice that sounded like it was coming from underwater. He'd left everything to me. The business, the truck, the tools, our savings, and the house. The house we'd toasted to just days before. The house that was supposed to be our future. I couldn't even look at the closing documents. Every signature felt like signing his death certificate all over again. That's when Victoria stepped in. She showed up at my apartment the day after the funeral with takeout I couldn't eat and a determined expression I mistook for. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Love. She said I shouldn't be alone. She said I wasn't thinking clearly. She said there were so many legal and financial matters to handle, and I was in no state to deal with them. She was right about that last part at least. I could barely get out of bed, could barely remember to drink water, could barely exist in a world that no longer had Marcus in it. So when she offered to help with the paperwork, to handle the estate details, to deal with the house closing that I couldn't face, I said yes. I signed whatever she put in front of me. I trusted her because she was my sister and because I was drowning and she was the only one throwing me a rope. Except the rope was an anchor. Within 3 months of Marcus's death, Victoria had somehow become the primary owner of Lighthouse Cottage. The property that Marcus and I had bought together, that was supposed to be in my name alone after his passing, was suddenly titled in her name with me listed as some kind of secondary beneficiary or co-owner. The legal language was confusing, and every time I tried to read through it my vision would blur with tears. When I finally managed to ask her about it, sitting in her pristine downtown condo with its view of the harbor, she had an explanation ready. She said we'd done it for tax purposes, for estate protection, that with Dad's help they'd structured it so I wouldn't lose the property to probate complications or creditors. She said it was temporary, just until I was more stable, just until the grief wasn't so fresh. She said it with such confidence, such concern in her eyes, that I believed her. Or maybe I was just too tired to fight. Maybe some part of me didn't care because Marcus was gone and the house without him felt like a mausoleum anyway. But temporary became permanent. 6 months turned into a year. Victoria started making decisions about the property without consulting me. She hired contractors for the renovations. She picked paint colors and fixtures and furniture. Every time I asked when we were going to sort out the paperwork, transfer it back to my name, she had a reason why now wasn't the right time. The market was volatile. There were tax implications we needed to wait out. Dad was working on a better legal structure. It was always soon, always just around the corner, always just after this one last thing. I started to push back. Started to insist on being involved in decisions, on seeing the actual documents, on understanding what was happening with the property that was supposed to be my memorial to Marcus. That's when everything changed. That's when the family narrative shifted from poor grieving Natalie to unstable, irrational Natalie, who couldn't be trusted with her own affairs. It started with small comments at family dinners. Mom mentioning to Aunt Diane how worried she was about my mental state. Dad casually bringing up conservatorship in conversation, talking about how sometimes people need help managing their lives after trauma. Victoria expressing concern to anyone who would listen about my erratic behavior, my mood swings, my inability to make rational decisions. None of it was true, but truth doesn't matter when the people telling the lies are lawyers who know exactly how to build a convincing narrative. The day I finally demanded to see all the property documents, insisted that Victoria either transfer the house to me or I'd get my own attorney, was the day she pulled out her phone during Sunday dinner and played a voicemail I'd left her at 2 in the morning. I'd been crying, my words were slurred from the sleeping pills I'd taken, and I was rambling about Marcus, about the house, about how nothing made sense anymore. Out of context, it sounded exactly like what she wanted it to sound like. Evidence of instability. Proof that I wasn't capable of handling my own affairs. Dad listened to that voicemail with his lawyer face on, the one that showed nothing. Mom looked at me with something between pity and disappointment. And Victoria, sweet concerned Victoria, said she thought I needed professional help before we could move forward with any property discussions. I was so shocked, so blindsided that I just sat there. Couldn't even defend myself because what was I going to say? Yes, I'd been a mess. Yes, I'd called her crying in the middle of the night more times than I could count. Yes, I'd leaned on her maybe too hard, trusted her maybe too much. But that didn't mean I was incompetent. That didn't mean she had the right to take what was mine. When I finally found my voice and said as much, said that grief didn't make me incapable, that I wanted my house back, Dad cut me off. He said we could discuss it. When I was calmer, Mom suggested I talk to someone, a therapist maybe, someone who could help me process everything in a healthy way. And Victoria, my sister who'd held my hand through Marcus's funeral, just looked at me with tears in her eyes and said she was only trying to protect me from myself. That's when Uncle Greg chimed in, backing up Victoria's version of events. That's when Aunt Diane started posting on Facebook about praying for family members going through mental health crises. That's when I realized I was losing more than the house. I was losing my entire family, and they were doing it while convinced they were the heroes of the story. I stopped going to family dinners after that. Stopped answering calls from my parents. Stopped trying to explain myself to people who had already decided what my story was. The isolation happened gradually, then all at once. Cousins who used to text me about random things suddenly went quiet. Aunt Diane unfriended me on social media. Uncle Greg stopped inviting me to his annual 4th of July barbecue that I'd attended every year since I was born. It was like I'd been erased from the family photo album, cropped out so cleanly that after a while people probably forgot I'd been there at all. The only person who reached out was Tyler, my younger cousin who'd always been the black sheep of the family himself. He sent me a message saying he didn't believe what they were saying about me, that something felt wrong about the whole situation. But he was in graduate school in Seattle, too far away to do much more than offer moral support through sporadic text messages. I appreciated it more than he probably knew, but it didn't change the fact that I was fundamentally alone. The worst part wasn't the isolation itself. It was watching Victoria move forward with renovations on Lighthouse Cottage like she'd earned it. She posted progress photos on Instagram with captions about following your dreams and making vision boards reality. She tagged interior designers and contractors, thanking them for helping bring her dream home to life. My dream home. The one Marcus and I had planned down to the smallest detail. She changed everything. Painted the shutters gray instead of blue. Tore out the original hardwood floors Marcus had been so excited to restore, and replaced them with trendy luxury vinyl. Converted the lighthouse studio space I'd imagined painting into a wine cellar. Every change felt like another small death. Another piece of Marcus being erased. I wanted to comment on those posts to tell everyone the truth, but I knew how it would look. Bitter, jealous, unstable. Exactly what they already believed about me. So I stayed silent and watched my life be rewritten by someone who knew exactly how to play the victim while wielding the knife. Money became an immediate problem. Marcus's furniture business had died with him, and while there was some life insurance, most of it had gone to funeral costs and settling his remaining debts. The nonprofit job barely covered rent in Portland, and without Marcus's income one was hemorrhaging savings faster than I could replenish them. I picked up weekend shifts at a cafe, then evening shifts at a bookstore, then overnight stocking at a grocery store. I was working 70 hours a week and still falling behind. My apartment above the bookstore, the one that had felt cozy and full of possibility when Marcus was alive, now felt like a cell. Every corner held memories that hurt to look at. His coffee mug still in the dish rack. His jacket still hanging by the door. The half-finished furniture piece he'd been building in the corner. A small table for the entryway of the house we'd never get to share. I couldn't afford to stay, but I couldn't afford to leave either. By month 18 after Marcus's death, I was drowning. I stopped painting entirely because I couldn't afford supplies and couldn't summon the emotional energy anyway. The galleries that had been starting to show my work stopped calling. I'd missed too many deadlines, failed to deliver on too many promises. My reputation in the local art scene evaporated as quickly as it had been building. That's when the eviction notice came. The bookstore building had been sold to developers who wanted to gut it and turn it into condos. All the tenants had 90 days to vacate. 90 days to find a new place I couldn't afford in a city where rent was climbing faster than wages. I spent hours scrolling through listings, doing math that never worked out, applying for apartments that rejected me for having too many jobs and not enough income. It was absurd. I was working myself into the ground and still couldn't qualify for a studio apartment in the worst neighborhood. I thought about leaving Portland entirely, moving somewhere cheaper, starting over where nobody knew my story. But that felt like letting them win. Like admitting that Victoria had successfully stolen not just my house but my entire life. So instead I made a decision that hurt more than I expected. I called Jenna. Jenna and I had met in college, bonded over late-night painting sessions and terrible coffee from the campus cafe. She'd been at my wedding, had loved Marcus almost as much as I did, and had tried to stay in touch after he died. But I'd pushed her away along with everyone else, too submerged in grief to maintain friendships that reminded me of happier times. When I called her at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night and asked if her offer to help still stood, there was a long pause. Then she said, of course, obviously, why did I even have to ask? 2 weeks later, I was sleeping on an air mattress in her spare room in a neighborhood that smelled like exhaust fumes and fried food. Jenna worked as a nurse at Emmanuel Hospital, pulling 12-hour shifts that meant we barely saw each other. But she never made me feel like a burden. She'd leave encouraging notes on the bathroom mirror. She'd buy my favorite tea even though I knew her budget was tight. She'd sit with me on her days off and just exist in the same space without demanding conversation or explanations. Slowly, painfully, I started to resemble a person again. I found work at Harborview Diner, a 24-hour place near the waterfront that catered to dock workers, cab drivers, and insomniacs. The night shift paid slightly more, and meant I didn't have to see many people I knew. I served coffee and pie to strangers at 3 in the morning, collected tips that barely covered bus fare, and tried not to think about the fact that I had a degree and a dead husband in a stolen house. My coworkers were kind in the way people who've all been knocked down a few times are kind. They didn't ask questions. They covered shifts when I couldn't stop crying in the walk-in freezer. They split their tips when mine were short. There was Maria, a grandmother raising 3 grandkids after her daughter overdosed. There was Jerome, a former engineer who'd lost everything in a divorce and hadn't quite figured out how to rebuild. There was Butterfly, which probably wasn't her real name but nobody asked, who read tarot cards on her breaks and told me I had a long road ahead but the destination was worth it. I didn't believe in tarot, but I appreciated the sentiment. These people became my family in a way my actual family had never been. They showed up. They saw me at my worst and didn't turn away. They proved that love doesn't have to be conditional or transactional, that sometimes it's just showing up with extra fries because you know someone skipped dinner again. During my breaks, I'd walk down to the waterfront and stare across the water toward where Ashford sat on the coast. I couldn't see it from Portland, obviously, but I'd look in that direction anyway and think about Lighthouse Cottage. Wonder what Victoria had changed that week. Wonder if she ever thought about me at all, or if I'd been successfully erased from her conscience along with the property records. I started going to the library on my days off, using their computers to research property law. I didn't know what I was looking for exactly, just some loophole, some mistake, some proof that what she'd done was illegal, and not just morally bankrupt. But every search led me back to the same conclusion. Without money for a lawyer, without documents I'd signed while too grief-stricken to read them properly, without witnesses who'd contradict my own family's version of events, I had nothing. The system wasn't designed to help people like me. It was designed to protect people like Victoria, people with resources and family connections, and the confidence to look officials in the eye and lie smoothly. I thought about giving up more times than I can count. Thought about accepting that some injustices don't get resolved, that sometimes the bad guys win and you just have to learn to live with it. I thought about moving to Seattle near Tyler, starting completely fresh where nobody knew about Marcus or the house or my family. But something kept stopping me. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was the memory of Marcus's face when we toasted on that porch. Maybe it was just the accumulated weight of every small injustice I'd swallowed over the years. Every time I'd made myself smaller to make my family more comfortable. Whatever it was, it hardened into something like determination. I couldn't afford a lawyer, but I could educate myself. I started spending my library time reading case law, understanding property transfer procedures, learning the language of real estate fraud. I requested copies of documents from the county recorder's office, paying fees I could barely afford to get paperwork related to the Lighthouse Cottage property. Most of it was confusing legal jargon, but I kept at it, kept highlighting sections, kept cross-referencing dates and signatures. That's when I noticed the first discrepancy. The transfer document that put Victoria's name on the deed was dated 3 days before Marcus's funeral. 3 days. I'd barely been functional. I couldn't have told you what year it was, let alone made informed decisions about property transfers. But there was my signature, witnessed by someone named Patricia Morrison who I'd never heard of in my life. I pulled more documents. The original purchase agreement with both Marcus's and my name. The mortgage documents. The death certificate. The will that clearly stated all property passed to me. Then this random transfer document that appeared like a magic trick, pulling ownership away from me and handing it to Victoria. I started making copies, building a file, documenting everything. I didn't know what I'd do with it yet, but it felt important to have proof that I wasn't crazy, that something was genuinely wrong with this picture. Jenna would come home from her shifts and find me surrounded by papers, highlighters in 4 different colors, sticky notes covering every surface. She never told me I was obsessing or wasting my time. She'd just make us both tea and ask what I'd found. Months passed like this. Work, research, sleep, repeat. I was barely surviving financially, but something had shifted internally. I wasn't just grieving anymore. I was angry, and anger turned out to be a much better fuel than despair. I started taking community college courses in paralegal studies, thinking maybe if I understood the system better I could find a way through it. The courses were online and cheap enough that I could manage the tuition by picking up extra diner shifts. I was exhausted constantly, running on coffee and spite, but I was moving forward instead of just treading water. My instructor for the property law course was a retired lawyer named Mr. Pemberton who'd left private practice after his wife died and decided to teach instead. He had a reputation for being demanding and not particularly sympathetic, which meant most students avoided his sections. But I found his bluntness refreshing after years of people handling me with kid gloves or outright lying to my face. I approached him after class one evening, about 8 months into my diner job, and asked if he'd be willing to look at some documents off the record. I expected him to say no, to cite conflicts of interest or lack of time or any number of reasonable excuses. Instead, he asked if I had coffee money. We sat in a corner booth at a cafe near campus, while he reviewed my file with the kind of focused intensity that reminded me of Marcus, examining a piece of wood for flaws. He didn't speak for 20 minutes, just read and made occasional notes in margins with a pen he produced from his jacket pocket. Finally, he looked up and asked me to walk him through the timeline again, every detail I could remember about those weeks after Marcus died. I did, and watching his expression change from neutral to troubled felt like the first validation I'd received in 2 years. When I finished, he sat back, tapped his pen against the table, and said 3 words that changed everything. "This is fraud." He explained that the timeline alone was suspicious, that transfer documents executed during a period of obvious mental incapacity could potentially be challenged, that the witness signature was likely forged given that I'd never met Patricia Morrison and she'd later claim the same when questioned properly. He said my father, as an estate planning attorney, would have known all of this, which meant his involvement wasn't protective but predatory. He said cases like mine were difficult because family law gets murky and judges are reluctant to assume the worst about family members, but that I had enough irregularities to warrant investigation at minimum. Then he said the hard part. It would require money I didn't have, time I couldn't spare, and the willingness to go to war with my entire family in a very public way. He asked if I was prepared for that. I thought about Marcus, about the porch where we'd made our toast, about Victoria's Instagram posts and my mother's pitying looks and the 2 years I'd spent working 3 jobs while my sister lived in the house that was supposed to be my healing place. I told Mr. Pemberton I was prepared. He agreed to help me pro bono, which I later learned meant he was donating his time without payment. He said he'd retired from practicing law but maintained his license for situations exactly like this, cases where the system had failed someone who deserved better. He started by filing requests for additional documents, official inquiries that couldn't be ignored the way my personal requests had been. He contacted Patricia Morrison directly, and she confirmed she'd never witnessed any document signing, that someone had forged her signature using her notary stamp which had been stolen from her office around that time. She filed her own police report, which added a criminal element to what had been a civil matter. Things started moving faster than I'd anticipated. Mr. Pemberton scheduled a consultation with the district attorney's office. He reached out to other attorneys who'd worked with my father, asking careful questions about his ethics record. He discovered I wasn't the first person to raise concerns about Brooks and Associates' handling of estate documents, just the first person with enough evidence and stubbornness to push forward. The investigation took months. During that time I kept working at the diner, kept living on Jenna's air mattress, kept taking classes and pretending my life wasn't quietly imploding in slow motion. Victoria posted pictures of hosting Thanksgiving at Lighthouse Cottage. My entire family gathered around a table in the dining room where Marcus and I were supposed to grow old together. I didn't let myself look at those photos for more than a few seconds, but those seconds carved themselves into my memory anyway. My mother's smile. My father's hand on Victoria's shoulder. The complete absence of any acknowledgement that I'd ever existed or mattered. Jenna found me crying in the bathroom that night and didn't say anything, just sat on the floor next to me until I could breathe normally again. She asked if I wanted to stop, if pursuing this was worth the pain it was causing. I told her it wasn't about worth anymore. It was about truth. About making sure Marcus's memory wasn't erased along with my ownership. About proving that you can't just steal someone's life because you're charming and connected and confident enough to think you'll get away with it. Mr. Pemberton called me in February, almost 3 years after Marcus's death. He said we had enough for a civil suit and potentially criminal charges for fraud and forgery. He said the DA was interested but cautious, that cases against prominent families were politically complicated. He said we could proceed but I needed to understand that this would get ugly, that my family would fight back with everything they had, that the court of public opinion might not be kind even if the legal system eventually was. He asked me one more time if I was sure. I thought about that voicemail Victoria had played at dinner, the one she'd kept as insurance. I thought about how they'd weaponized my grief, turned my vulnerability into evidence of incompetence. I thought about Marcus's laugh and his calloused hands and the future weed plan that they'd stolen. I told Mr. Pemberton to file everything. Within a week, Victoria received notice of the lawsuit. Within 2 weeks, my parents received subpoenas for their business records. Within 3 weeks, the local Ashford newspaper ran a story about fraud allegations against a prominent family. The comments section filled with people defending the Brooks family, calling me a money-hungry opportunist, suggesting I was mentally unstable, and seeking revenge for imagined slights. But there were other comments too. People who'd had strange experiences with Brooks and Associates. People who'd felt pressured into estate arrangements they didn't fully understand. People who said they'd always thought something was off, but hadn't wanted to speak up against such a powerful family. Tyler called me for the first time in months. He said half the family wasn't speaking to him because he told Aunt Diane he believed my version of events. He said my mother had cried at Sunday dinner, saying I was trying to destroy them. He said my father had hired 3 different law firms to defend against the suit. Then he said something I hadn't expected. He said he'd found something in his parents' attic while helping them prepare to move. Documents. Old files from when his dad had been helping mine with various estate cases. He didn't know if they were relevant but thought I should know they existed. I gave him Mr. Pemberton's contact information and told him to send everything. 2 days later Mr. Pemberton called me with barely contained excitement in his voice. Tyler had found a pattern. Multiple cases over the past decade where Brooks and Associates had handled estate transfers that benefited family members or close associates, always during periods when the actual property owners were vulnerable or incapacitated. My case wasn't unique. It was just the first time someone had fought back hard enough for the pattern to become visible. The deposition schedule arrived in March, thick envelopes with official seals that meant everyone involved would have to sit in a conference room and answer questions under oath. Victoria was scheduled first, then my parents, then Aunt Diane, who'd apparently been involved in some of the document coordination. I wasn't required to attend Victoria's deposition, but Mr. Pemberton thought it might be useful for me to observe, to see how she handled direct questioning when she couldn't control the narrative. We sat in a sterile conference room at a law office in downtown Portland, everything gray and beige and aggressively neutral. Victoria arrived 20 minutes late wearing a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than my monthly income. She had 2 attorneys with her, both from expensive firms Dad had called in as favors. She didn't look at me when she entered, kept her eyes fixed on some point above everyone's heads like she was too important to acknowledge the mess happening around her. The deposition started with basic questions. Her name, her relationship to me, her profession. She answered in a tone that suggested she was being enormously patient with a tedious process. Corporate attorney for a tech firm in Portland, which was new information to me. Apparently she'd been climbing career ladders while simultaneously stealing my house. When Mr. Pemberton started asking about the property transfer, her composure cracked just slightly. She claimed she'd been trying to help me, that I'd been suicidal in the weeks after Marcus died, that she'd been terrified I'd make impulsive financial decisions that would leave me destitute. The transfer had been temporary, she insisted, just until I stabilized. When asked why the transfer had never been reversed, why she'd proceeded with renovations as if the property was permanently hers, she said she tried to discuss it with me multiple times, but I'd been unresponsive and hostile. She made it sound so reasonable, so concerned. If I hadn't lived through the actual events, I might have believed her myself. Mr. Pemberton pulled out the timeline then, walking through each date methodically. The property transfer dated 3 days before the funeral when I'd been barely conscious. The renovation contracts signed 2 months later without my knowledge or consent. The mortgage refinance in her name only that had paid off the original loan Marcus and I had taken out. Each question peeled back another layer of the story she'd constructed. When he asked about Patricia Morrison, the supposed witness, Victoria's attorney objected, and there was a whole procedural argument I didn't fully understand. But I watched Victoria's face during that argument and saw what I'd been looking for. Fear. Real, undeniable fear that her careful construction was collapsing. The deposition lasted 4 hours. By the end, Victoria's makeup had faded and her voice had lost its confident edge. She left without looking at anyone, her attorneys flanking her like bodyguards protecting a celebrity from paparazzi. My parents' deposition was scheduled for the following week. I didn't attend that one because Mr. Pemberton thought my presence would be too inflammatory, that Dad would use it to play the wounded father card. But he called me afterward and his voice had the grim satisfaction of someone who just won a significant battle. My father had been forced to admit he'd supervised the property transfer, that he'd been aware of the timing, that he'd used his position as an estate planning attorney to facilitate something he knew was legally questionable at best. He tried to frame it as protecting me from predatory creditors, from my own grief-impaired judgment, from a dozen other threats that didn't actually exist. But under sustained questioning he'd contradicted himself repeatedly, and the court reporter had captured every inconsistency. My mother had been worse in some ways. She'd cried through most of her testimony, playing the worried mother so convincingly that Mr. Pemberton said even he almost felt sorry for her. She claimed she just wanted both her daughters to be happy, that she'd believed Victoria's version of events, that she'd had no idea there were legal irregularities involved. It would have been more believable if the documents Tyler found hadn't included emails from her to my father discussing the property transfer strategy. The case started attracting attention beyond Ashford. A legal blog focused on estate fraud picked up the story, writing about how prominent families sometimes weaponized grief to consolidate assets. A podcast about white-collar crime did an episode examining the pattern of cases Tyler had uncovered. Suddenly I wasn't just the unstable daughter anymore. I was the victim of a systematic scheme, and public opinion was shifting faster than my family could control it. Victoria locked down her social media after people started leaving comments on her Lighthouse Cottage posts, asking if she'd stolen the house. My parents' law firm lost 3 major clients in 2 weeks. Uncle Greg, who'd backed up Victoria's version of events so confidently at that terrible Sunday dinner, suddenly claimed he'd been misled and hadn't understood the full situation. The family unity that had been so solid against me started showing cracks, as people scrambled to distance themselves from the worst of it. Through all of this I kept working at Harborview Diner, kept living on Jenna's air mattress, kept taking paralegal courses and learning how the system worked from the inside. The other servers started calling me the lawyer, half joking and half serious. Maria asked if I'd look at some documents related to her granddaughter's custody case. Jerome wanted advice about his child support arrangement. Butterfly just read my tarot every week and kept saying the Tower card was appearing, which apparently meant dramatic upheaval and necessary destruction before rebuilding. I didn't put much stock in tarot, but I appreciated the metaphor. My old life had been a tower built on sand, pretty to look at but fundamentally unstable. It had taken losing everything to realize I'd never actually had it to begin with. This new life I was building might be harder and uglier, but at least it was real, constructed from materials I'd chosen and effort I'd earned. The settlement offer came in May. Victoria's attorneys proposed she'd transfer the property back to me and pay for all legal fees incurred, in exchange for me dropping the civil suit and agreeing not to pursue criminal charges. It was a good offer objectively. I'd get my house back without years of litigation, without the risk of losing in court, without the continued emotional toll of fighting my entire family. Mr. Pemberton laid out the pros and cons methodically, making sure I understood that taking a case to trial was always a gamble, that juries were unpredictable, that even with strong evidence there was no guarantee of winning. He said the decision was mine, but that from a purely legal standpoint the settlement accomplished everything we'd set out to do. I asked him what happened if I rejected it. He said we'd proceed to trial, which could take another year minimum, which would cost Victoria and my parents significantly more money, which would air every piece of their dirty laundry in public court documents that reporters could access. He said it would be brutal for everyone involved, including me. He asked what I wanted to achieve that the settlement wouldn't provide. I thought about that question for 3 days. Jenna and I talked through it over countless cups of tea at her tiny kitchen table. Tyler called with his opinion, which was that I should take the settlement and move on, that I'd already proven my point and won. Even Maria at the diner weighed in, saying sometimes you have to accept the apology you're never going to get and just take what you can. They were all probably right from a practical standpoint. But there was something about the settlement that felt incomplete, like accepting it would let Victoria and my parents continue believing they'd been trying to help me, that their intentions had been good even if their methods were questionable. The settlement didn't require them to admit fraud. It didn't require them to acknowledge they'd deliberately stolen from me during the worst period of my life. It let them save face and maintain their position in the community, while I got my property back and disappeared quietly. I'd spent 3 years being quiet. I'd spent 3 years accepting that my grief made me unreliable, that my version of events didn't matter as much as theirs. The settlement was asking me to be quiet one more time. I called Mr. Pemberton on a Tuesday morning before my shift at the diner and told him to reject the settlement offer. He asked if I was sure, running through the risks one more time. I told him I didn't want a settlement that protected their reputation. I wanted a verdict that named what they'd done accurately. Fraud. Theft. Elder abuse statutes applied to anyone in a diminished mental state, which I had been. I wanted it on record in a way that couldn't be sealed or explained away at future dinner parties. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said he'd been hoping I'd say that because he'd found 2 more families willing to testify about similar experiences with Brooks and Associates. We were going to trial and we were going to win. The certainty in his voice was the first time I'd felt genuinely hopeful since Marcus died. Not hope that things would go back to how they were, but hope that justice might actually exist in some functional form. The trial date was set for September, nearly 4 years after Marcus's death. 4 years of rebuilding myself from component parts, of learning to exist in a world that had tried to erase me. I'd saved enough money by that point to move out of Jenna's spare room and into a studio apartment that was small and drafty but mine. I'd finished my paralegal certificate and gotten a job at a small firm that specialized in tenant rights, work that felt meaningful and used the skills I'd spent years developing. I'd even started painting again, nothing like the work I'd done before Marcus died, but something new that felt honest to who I'd become. The paintings were darker, more abstract, full of broken things being reassembled incorrectly but beautifully. A gallery in Southeast Portland agreed to show 3 of them in a group exhibition. I didn't tell anyone except Jenna and Tyler. The opening was the same week I got notice that Victoria wanted to settle again, this time for double the property value if I just make it all go away. Mr. Pemberton seemed almost offended by the second settlement offer, like they thought I could be bought off if the number was high enough. He sent back a counteroffer that was essentially go to trial or admit to fraud publicly, your choice. They chose trial. The legal team my family assembled was impressive and expensive. 3 attorneys from a firm that specialized in defending white-collar criminals. They filed motion after motion trying to get evidence excluded, trying to delay the trial date, trying to separate Victoria's case from my parents' involvement. Mr. Pemberton countered every motion with filings that were frankly beautiful to read, clear and logical and devastating. He'd recruited 2 other attorneys from his former firm to help pro bono, both of them semi-retired and apparently bored enough that the prospect of taking down a corrupt family practice sounded like entertainment. We had strategy sessions in coffee shops where they'd argue case law like it was sports statistics, getting genuinely excited about precedents and procedural tactics I barely understood. But I understood enough to know we had a real chance. The other families Tyler had found started coming forward more publicly as the trial date approached. There was an elderly couple whose family home had somehow been transferred to their nephew, my father's college roommate, during the wife's cancer treatment. There was a single mother who'd lost her business property in a complicated trust arrangement that had been explained to her while she was recovering from a car accident. There was a veteran whose disability settlement had been funneled into investments managed by a company my uncle partially owned. The pattern was consistent and damning. Brooks and Associates had spent years preying on vulnerable people, using their legal expertise and community standing to commit theft that looked like estate planning. The local news picked up the story as the trial approached, running segments about elder abuse and legal ethics. My father's face appeared on television in contexts he'd never imagined, not as the respected principal-turned-attorney but as the defendant in a fraud case. I went back to Ashford for the first time in 3 years the week before trial started. I needed to see Lighthouse Cottage, needed to face it as the person I'd become rather than the person who'd lost it. I drove out alone on a Saturday morning, parked across the street like Marcus and I used to do when it was still just a dream. Victoria had finished the renovations. The house looked magazine perfect now, all the rough edges smoothed away. All the character that had made it special erased in favor of trendy minimalism. The white clapboard siding was still white but a different shade, brighter and more sterile. The shutters were gray like I'd seen in photos, not the ocean blue Marcus had wanted. The wraparound porch had new railings made of steel and glass instead of the vintage wood we'd planned to restore. It looked expensive and soulless, like a house from a catalog, rather than a home where actual people lived. I sat in my car staring at it and felt something unexpected. Not rage or grief, but detachment. This wasn't my house anymore. Whatever I'd imagined building here with Marcus had died with him. Even if I won it back in court, it would never be what we dreamed together. That realization should have been devastating, but instead it felt like permission. Permission to stop fighting for a past that was gone, and start building toward a future that didn't require this specific house to be meaningful. I'd spent 3 years treating Lighthouse Cottage like it was Marcus's memorial, like losing it meant losing him all over again. But Marcus wasn't in the house. He was in the skills he'd taught me about seeing potential in broken things. He was in the courage to start over when everything fell apart. He was in the choice to fight back when fighting back seemed impossible. The house was just property, just wood and glass and stolen money. What mattered was proving that theft had consequences, that grief didn't make you fair game, that families who weaponized love deserved to lose it. I took one last long look at the gray shutters that should have been blue. Then I drove back to Portland. I had a trial to win. The week before trial I barely slept. Mr. Pemberton had prepared me for testimony, running through potential questions the defense would ask, teaching me how to answer clearly without getting emotional or defensive. He said the jury would be watching my demeanor as much as listening to my words, that I needed to come across as credible and sympathetic without seeming rehearsed. We practiced in his office after hours, him playing the aggressive defense attorney, me learning to stay calm while he implied I was lying for money or revenge. It was exhausting and uncomfortable but necessary. Jenna took time off work to come to the sessions, sitting in as a fake jury member and giving feedback about what worked and what didn't. She said I needed to slow down when I got nervous because I started talking too fast and swallowing words. She said I should look at the jury when answering questions instead of looking at Mr. Pemberton for approval. She said I was stronger than I thought and the jury would see that if I let them. Tyler drove down from Seattle the day before trial started, showing up at my apartment with takeout and a willingness to just sit with me while I panicked quietly. He'd been subpoenaed to testify about the documents he'd found, and he was nervous too but trying to hide it for my sake. We ate Thai food on my floor and talked about everything except the trial. He told me about his graduate program, about the girl he'd been seeing who thought his family drama was fascinatingly dysfunctional. I told him about my job, about the paintings I'd been making, about how weird it was to have built a whole new life in the ruins of my old one. He said I'd always been the strongest person in the family, that everyone else just had better PR. I didn't feel strong. I felt terrified and exhausted and like I might throw up at any moment. But I appreciated the vote of confidence. He left around midnight, hugging me at the door and telling me to call him if I needed anything, even if it was 3 in the morning and I just needed someone to tell me I wasn't crazy. I locked the door behind him and stood in my quiet apartment thinking about all the versions of myself that had led to this moment. The golden daughter who believed her family's love was unconditional. The grieving widow who'd trusted the wrong person at the worst possible time. The diner waitress who'd learned to survive on nothing. The paralegal student who discovered that knowledge was a kind of power. Tomorrow I'd add another version. The plaintiff who'd refused to stay quiet. The courthouse smelled like floor polish and old wood, the kind of institutional smell that probably hadn't changed in 50 years. I arrived early with Mr. Pemberton, both of us carrying boxes of documents and evidence that represented 3 years of investigation. The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined, more intimate and less dramatic than the television versions. Rows of wooden benches, a judge's bench that looked imposing but worn, a jury box that was still empty. We set up at the plaintiff's table, organizing files and evidence markers, creating a physical representation of everything Victoria had taken. Across the aisle, Victoria sat with her legal team, 3 attorneys in matching navy suits arranging their own mountain of paperwork. She looked smaller somehow, less confident than she'd appeared in depositions. Her eyes darted around the room, landing everywhere except on me. My parents sat behind her in the gallery section, both dressed formally like they were attending a funeral. Dad's face was stone, revealing nothing. Mom kept twisting a tissue in her hands, shredding it into small pieces that fell like snow onto her lap. The jury selection took most of the first day, a tedious process of potential jurors being questioned about their backgrounds, their opinions on family relationships, their ability to be impartial. Mr. Pemberton was meticulous, asking questions that seemed innocuous but were clearly designed to weed out anyone who might be too sympathetic to the prominent family defense narrative. By the end of the day we had 12 jurors and 2 alternates, a mix of ages and backgrounds that Mr. Pemberton seemed cautiously optimistic about. One was a retired schoolteacher. Another was a construction worker. A young woman who worked in tech. An older man who'd owned a small business. Regular people who'd hopefully see through the expensive legal maneuvering to the simple truth underneath. I studied their faces, trying to imagine what they thought of me, whether they saw a victim or an opportunist. Most of them just looked tired and slightly inconvenienced, which I supposed was normal for people dragged into jury duty. The prosecution's opening statement began the next morning. Mr. Pemberton stood before the jury with the kind of calm authority that came from decades of practice. He didn't theatrically point at Victoria or raise his voice for dramatic effect. He just told the story chronologically, factually, letting the events speak for themselves. A young couple with a dream. A tragic death. A grieving widow in the worst moment of her life. A sister who offered help that turned into theft. Documents signed under duress, signatures forged. A property systematically stolen while the rightful owner was too destroyed to fight back. He walked them through the timeline, highlighting the 3 days between property transfer and funeral, the impossibility of informed consent during that period. He showed them the mortgage refinance that had erased Marcus's and my names entirely, replacing them with Victoria's alone. He promised to bring witnesses who'd experienced similar patterns with Brooks and Associates, who'd show this wasn't an isolated misunderstanding, but a systematic practice. When he finished, the jury looked attentive and troubled, which was all we could hope for at this stage. Victoria's lead attorney, a man named Hartley with silver hair and a voice like expensive scotch, presented their opening with polished confidence. He painted Victoria as the protective older sister who'd stepped in to save me from myself, who'd taken on the burden of managing property I couldn't handle, who'd tried repeatedly to have adult conversations about the arrangement only to be met with hostility and accusations. He suggested I'd been mentally unstable, that my grief had warped into paranoia and greed, that I was now rewriting history to punish a sister who'd done nothing but try to help. He talked about the voicemail, the one Victoria had played at that dinner years ago, promising the jury they'd hear evidence of my instability firsthand. He made it sound so reasonable, so tragic, like I was the villain in a story about mental illness and family betrayal. I watched the jury's faces during his statement and saw some of them nodding slightly, considering his narrative. It was going to be harder than I'd thought to break through that carefully constructed fiction. The first witnesses were foundational, people who could establish facts without getting into the emotional complexity. The county recorder who confirmed the timeline of document filings. The mortgage broker who testified that I hadn't been present for the refinancing, that Victoria had handled everything alone. Patricia Morrison, the notary whose signature had been forged, who testified that she'd never met me, had never witnessed any document signing, and had reported her stolen notary stamp around the same time as the property transfer. Her testimony was damaging in a quiet way, each answer another brick in the wall Mr. Pemberton was building. The defense tried to suggest she was misremembering, that perhaps she'd witnessed something and forgotten, but she was unshakable. She had records. She had the police report about the stolen stamp. She had no reason to lie, which made her credibility almost bulletproof. Then came the other families, the pattern evidence that turned this from a family dispute into something bigger. The elderly couple whose home had been transferred testified together, the husband's voice shaking as he described being told the arrangement was for their protection, only to discover years later that they no longer owned the house they'd lived in for 40 years. The single mother cried on the stand describing how she'd lost her business property, how she'd trusted my father because he was a respected attorney, how she'd been too overwhelmed recovering from her accident to question the documents he'd assured her were standard. The veteran was the most powerful witness, his military bearing and clear-eyed testimony about disability fraud lending weight that was hard to dismiss. The defense tried to argue these cases were different, that there was no direct evidence my father had acted improperly, that estate planning was complex and sometimes people misunderstood the arrangements. But the pattern was undeniable. Too many vulnerable people, too many convenient transfers, too many properties that had somehow ended up benefiting Brooks family associates. My testimony came on the 4th day. I'd been dreading it and preparing for it in equal measure, knowing this was the moment where everything could pivot. Mr. Pemberton walked me through the story gently, establishing the timeline of my relationship with Marcus, our purchase of the property, his death, my mental state in the aftermath. I kept my voice steady, looking at the jury like Jenna had taught me, making eye contact without staring. I described the day Victoria offered to help, how grateful I'd been, how much I'd needed someone to handle the overwhelming logistics of death and estates and paperwork I couldn't process. I explained that I'd signed documents without reading them carefully because I trusted her completely, because she was my sister and I'd been drowning. When Mr. Pemberton asked me to describe discovering the property transfer, my voice finally cracked. I hadn't meant to cry, but the memory of that moment, of realizing I'd been betrayed by the one person I thought would protect me, was still sharp enough to draw blood. The defense cross-examination was exactly as brutal as Mr. Pemberton had prepared me for. Hartley asked about my mental health history, about the voicemail, about whether I'd been prescribed anti-anxiety medication or sleeping pills. He asked if I'd been suicidal, if I'd made impulsive decisions, if I'd pushed away everyone who tried to help me. He played the voicemail for the jury, my voice slurred and desperate at 2 a.m, rambling about Marcus and loss and how nothing made sense anymore. It sounded worse than I remembered, worse because it was played in this sterile courtroom for strangers to judge. Hartley asked if that sounded like someone capable of making informed property decisions. I took a breath, remembered Mr. Pemberton's coaching, and said grief isn't incompetence. I said being devastated by my husband's death didn't give my sister the right to steal from me. I said that voicemail was from a person in pain reaching out to family for support, not evidence that I deserved to be robbed. Some of the jury members nodded. The retired teacher was writing notes. I counted that as a small victory. Victoria's testimony was scheduled for the 6th day, and the courtroom was more packed than it had been all week. Word had spread that this was the climactic moment, the defendant finally having to answer for her actions under oath. She took the stand wearing a conservative gray suit, her hair pulled back, makeup understated. She looked professional and composed, every inch the successful attorney who'd been wrongly accused. Her attorney walked her through the defense narrative carefully. She'd been worried about me. She'd consulted with Dad about the best way to protect my assets. The property transfer was meant to be temporary, just until I stabilized. She tried to talk to me about it multiple times, but I'd refused. She proceeded with renovations because the house was deteriorating and someone needed to make decisions. She'd planned to transfer it back eventually, but I'd become hostile and accusatory, making reasonable conversation impossible. It was a compelling performance. Tears at the right moments, voice breaking when she talked about how much she loved me and how painful this whole process had been. Mr. Pemberton's cross-examination was surgical. He started with the timeline, asking her to explain why a temporary protective measure required refinancing the mortgage in her name only. She said it was for credit purposes, which he immediately countered with evidence that her credit was worse than mine had been. He asked why she'd never put any agreement in writing, why there was no documentation of this supposed temporary arrangement. She said it was a family matter, they'd handled it informally, which he used to introduce evidence of other Brooks and Associates cases where informal family matters had become permanent thefts. He asked about specific renovation decisions, proving she'd made choices that directly contradicted plans Marcus and I had made, showing she'd known our vision for the property and had deliberately erased it. With each question, her composure fractured a little more, her answers becoming defensive and less consistent. By the end of his examination, she no longer looked like the protective sister. She looked like someone who'd been caught and was running out of places to hide. The closing arguments happened on day 8. Hartley made a final attempt to frame this as a tragic family misunderstanding, a sister who'd overstepped while trying to help, a plaintiff whose grief had twisted into greed and vindictiveness. He asked the jury to consider what they'd do for their own siblings, whether they'd take on burdens to protect family members who couldn't protect themselves. It was emotionally manipulative and probably effective for anyone who wanted to believe the pretty version. Mr. Pemberton's closing was simpler and more devastating. He put 2 documents side by side on the screen, the original property deed with Marcus's and my name, and the transfer document dated 3 days before the funeral. He asked the jury to look at those dates and imagine being in my position, Imagine losing your spouse and having your family steal from you in the same week. He reminded them of Patricia Morrison's testimony about the forged signature, of the other families who'd experienced similar thefts, of the pattern that made this clearly intentional rather than a misunderstanding. He said justice didn't require them to hate Victoria, just to acknowledge what she'd done and make it right. Then he sat down and we waited. The jury deliberated for 2 days. 2 days of sitting in courthouse hallways, of drinking bad coffee from vending machines, of trying not to imagine all the ways this could still go wrong. Jenna took more time off work to sit with me. Tyler paced and checked his phone obsessively. Mr. Pemberton projected calm confidence, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. On the afternoon of the second day, we got word the jury had reached a verdict. Everyone filed back into the courtroom, the same seats but the energy completely different now, charged with the weight of decision. The jury foreman was the construction worker, a middle-aged man with weathered hands who'd been taking detailed notes throughout the trial. He handed the verdict form to the bailiff, who handed it to the judge, who read it silently before asking the defendant to rise. Victoria stood, her attorneys on either side, and for the first time since this started she looked genuinely afraid. The foreman read the verdict. Guilty on all counts. Fraud, forgery, theft, exploitation of a vulnerable person. The jury found that Victoria had knowingly and intentionally stolen the property, that the transfer had not been temporary or protective, that she had acted with deliberate malice disguised as concern. They awarded me the property, full ownership restored, plus damages for the 3 years of lost use, plus punitive damages meant to punish the particularly egregious nature of the theft. The total came to more than the house was worth, a number that made Victoria's attorney's face go pale. The judge scheduled sentencing for the following month, thanked the jury for their service, and dismissed us. I sat there stunned, unable to process that it was over, that we'd actually won. Mr. Pemberton shook my hand formally, then pulled me into a brief hug that surprised us both. Jenna was crying. Tyler was grinning like he'd won the lottery himself. Across the aisle, Victoria sat frozen while her attorneys whispered urgently. My parents had already left, unwilling to witness the final collapse of their carefully maintained facade. The sentencing hearing came on a cold morning in October, almost exactly 4 years after Marcus died. The courthouse felt different this time. Less intimidating now that the verdict was behind us. Victoria had tried to appeal, filed motions to reduce the damages, done everything her expensive legal team could think of to minimize the consequences. All of it had been denied. The evidence was too clear, the jury verdict too definitive. She sat at the defense table looking hollow, like someone had reached inside and removed whatever spark had made her feel invincible. Her attorneys had prepared a statement about her remorse, her difficult childhood, the pressure of living up to family expectations. Standard mitigation tactics that might work on someone who hadn't spent 3 years watching her post Instagram photos from my stolen house. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Gardner, who'd presided over the trial with patient efficiency. She'd seen everything, heard every excuse, watched every witness break down or hold together. When it was time for victim impact statements, she nodded at Mr. Pemberton and I walked to the podium on shaking legs. I'd written something the night before, but standing there looking at Victoria, at my parents sitting behind her still playing the role of supportive family, the prepared words felt inadequate. I spoke without looking at my notes. I told the judge about Marcus, about our dreams for Lighthouse Cottage, about how we'd toasted to new beginnings on a broken porch 4 days before he died. I described coming back from his funeral to find my key didn't work, my family gone, my life packed into boxes like I'd never existed. I talked about the 3 years of working multiple jobs, of sleeping on an air mattress, of being told by everyone who was supposed to love me that I was crazy and unstable and lying. I said the theft of property was one thing, recoverable through legal action and jury verdicts. But Victoria had stolen something harder to quantify. She'd stolen my ability to trust, my belief that family meant safety, my confidence that the world operated on some basic principle of fairness. She'd taken my grief, the rawest, most vulnerable experience of my life, and weaponized it for personal gain. She'd let me believe I was losing my mind when really I was just being systematically robbed by someone who knew exactly how to exploit trauma. I looked at her finally and said I didn't need an apology because apologies required genuine remorse, and I didn't think she was capable of it. I just needed her to face real consequences for once in her privileged life, to understand that you can't steal someone's entire existence and walk away because your father is a lawyer and your family has connections. Then I sat down, my hands still shaking but my voice steady throughout. Judge Gardner listened to Victoria's attorney present the mitigation case, the childhood difficulties and career pressures, and supposed mental health struggles that had led to poor judgment. She listened to my father's letter asking for leniency for his daughter, claiming she'd been trying to help and had made mistakes but wasn't a criminal. She listened to all of it with the same neutral expression she'd maintained throughout the trial. Then she sentenced Victoria to 18 months in county jail, 5 years probation, and full restitution of all damages plus legal fees. She said the sentence reflected the calculated nature of the crime, the abuse of familial trust, and the lack of genuine remorse demonstrated throughout the proceedings. She said white-collar crime deserved real consequences. That privilege didn't exempt anyone from accountability. Victoria's face crumpled and she started crying, the first genuinely uncontrolled emotion I'd seen from her through this entire process. Her attorneys immediately began discussing appeals and bail pending appeal, but Judge Gardner was already moving on to the next case. It was over. The news coverage after sentencing was more extensive than I'd anticipated. The local stations ran stories about the prominent family's fall from grace, about estate fraud, about how vulnerable people needed to be cautious, even with family members claiming to help. My father's law firm officially closed 2 weeks later, unable to survive the reputational damage and ongoing investigations into their other cases. Brooks and Associates, the practice that had been a fixture in Ashford for 30 years, dissolved like it had never existed. My parents moved to Arizona shortly after, leaving no forwarding address, unable to face the community that had once respected them. Uncle Greg stopped returning Tyler's calls entirely. Aunt Diane deleted all her social media and apparently told anyone who asked that they'd never been that close to our part of the family anyway. The unified front that had stood against me for 3 years scattered like roaches when the light finally turned on. I drove out to Lighthouse Cottage on a Saturday in November, this time with keys that actually worked and a legal document that said the property was mine without qualification or asterisk. The house looked different than I remembered, both because of Victoria's renovations and because I was different. I walked through rooms that should have felt triumphant but mostly felt sad. The gray shutters that should have been blue. The vinyl floors that had replaced the hardwood Marcus wanted to restore. The wine cellar where my studio was supposed to be. Every room was a reminder that winning doesn't mean getting back what you lost. It means getting something different, something marked by all the fighting it took to reclaim it. I stood in the kitchen where Marcus and I had planned to cook dinners together, where we'd imagined lazy Sunday mornings and dinner parties with friends, and I cried for the last time about everything that would never happen. Then I called a contractor. Not to undo all of Victoria's changes, trying to resurrect a dream that had died with Marcus, but to make new changes that reflected who I'd become. I had the gray shutters replaced with deep green ones that reminded me of Oregon forests. I converted the wine cellar back into a studio space but designed it for the kind of abstract painting I did now, not the representational work I'd done before. I tore out the steel and glass porch railings and replaced them with wood, but a modern design rather than the vintage-style Marcus and I had planned. I was building something new from the bones of what we'd dreamed, honoring the past without being imprisoned by it. The work took months and most of the damage award money, but slowly Lighthouse Cottage became mine in a way it had never been before. Not the memorial I'd thought I needed, but a home that acknowledged everything I'd survived. Jenna came to visit once the renovations were mostly complete, bringing wine and takeout and the easy friendship that had kept me alive through the worst of it. We sat on the new porch watching the sun set over Cascade Bay, and she asked if it felt like victory. I thought about that question, about what victory even meant after everything that had happened. I'd won in court, gotten my property back, seen Victoria face consequences and my parents' practice destroyed. But Marcus was still gone. Those 3 years were still lost. The family that had abandoned me wasn't coming back to apologize or reconcile. Victory wasn't a restoration of what had been taken. It was something quieter and stranger. It was the knowledge that I'd fought back when fighting back seemed impossible. It was the proof that theft eventually gets exposed if you're stubborn enough to keep pulling threads. It was the understanding that you can lose everything and still rebuild something worth having. Tyler drove down from Seattle for Thanksgiving, the first holiday we'd spent together in 4 years. I cooked in the kitchen that was finally mine, served dinner on the porch Marcus had dreamed about, watched the lighthouse beacon I'd had restored cast its light across the water. Tyler asked if I'd heard from anyone in the family, if there had been any attempt at reconciliation. I told him Victoria was serving her sentence. My parents had sent a brief email asking me to drop any remaining legal action against them in exchange for them staying out of my life permanently, and everyone else had made their positions clear through their absence. He said he was sorry, like it was his fault that our family turned out to be held together by convenience rather than love. I told him he was the only one who'd chosen truth over comfort, that he'd proven family could be something you built rather than something you were born into. We talked about what came next, the practical questions about property taxes and maintenance costs, and whether I'd live in Lighthouse Cottage full-time or keep my Portland apartment. I'd been offered a position at a nonprofit legal aid organization, using my paralegal training to help people navigate the same kind of estate fraud I'd experienced. The work paid less than my current job but felt more aligned with who I'd become. I was considering it, weighing the satisfaction of meaningful work against the security of steady income. Tyler said I'd figure it out, that I'd proven I could survive worse uncertainty than career decisions. He was right, but it was still nice to hear. We cleaned up from dinner and sat on the porch wrapped in blankets as the temperature dropped, watching stars appear over the bay. He asked if I ever thought about forgiving them, not for their sake but for mine. I said forgiveness was complicated, that I'd stopped carrying around rage like a second skin, but that didn't mean I'd forgotten what they'd done or would ever trust them again. Acceptance wasn't the same as forgiveness. It was just acknowledging that people are who they show you they are, and my family had shown me clearly. Maria from Harborview Diner sent me a card when she heard about the verdict, a simple note saying she'd always known I'd win because truth has a way of surfacing eventually. I kept it on my refrigerator next to a photo of Marcus, tangible reminders that goodness existed even in systems designed to protect the powerful. I'd helped Maria with her custody case pro bono, using everything I'd learned to make sure she didn't lose her granddaughter to a system that didn't always recognize who the real caregivers were. She'd won too in her own way, and we'd celebrated with free pie at the diner where I no longer worked but still visited regularly. Those connections, the people who'd seen me at my lowest and helped anyway, meant more than any family reunion could have. They'd earned their place in my life through action rather than assuming it through biology. The first night I spent alone in Lighthouse Cottage, truly alone without contractors or friends helping with renovations, I walked through every room like I was meeting them for the first time. I stood in the studio space and imagined the paintings I'd create there. I sat on the porch and listened to waves crash against the rocks below. I climbed up to the lighthouse beacon and looked out over Cascade Bay, seeing the lights of Ashford in the distance, the town that had believed lies about me for years and was now quietly revising its memory. I thought about Marcus, about whether he'd be proud of who I'd become or disappointed that it had required losing so much to get here. I decided he'd probably be both, that real people contain multitudes and contradictions, that grief and growth aren't opposites but partners in the dance of continuing to exist after loss. I'd started writing about the experience, not a memoir exactly but something between legal analysis and personal essay, examining how estate fraud happens and what recourse victims have. Mr. Pemberton had agreed to review it for accuracy, and a small press that specialized in social justice narratives had expressed interest in publishing it. The idea of making my pain useful to others felt right, like turning all that suffering into something that might prevent someone else from going through the same thing. I worked on it, in the early mornings before work, sitting in the studio with coffee and the sound of seabirds, putting words to experiences I'd spent years trying to forget. The writing was difficult, requiring me to revisit the worst moments with clear eyes, rather than the protective blur of survival mode. But it was also cathartic, transforming chaotic emotion into structured narrative, proving that I could tell my own story accurately after years of other people telling it wrong. The lawsuit had one final consequence I hadn't anticipated. Other victims of Brooks and Associates started reaching out, people who'd lost property or money to my father's schemes and hadn't realized they had legal recourse. Mr. Pemberton connected them with attorneys who specialized in estate fraud, and several more cases were filed. The pattern Tyler had discovered was leading to a much broader investigation, potentially criminal charges beyond what Victoria had faced. My parents' attempt to disappear to Arizona might not provide the refuge they'd hoped for. Federal jurisdiction was complicated, but fraud that crossed state lines opened new avenues for prosecution. I wasn't directly involved in those cases, but I'd given statements, provided documentation, done whatever I could to help. Some people asked if I felt guilty about destroying my family's livelihood, if the consequences had gone too far. I didn't feel guilty at all. They destroyed their own livelihood through years of theft. I just finally turned on the lights. I stood on the porch of Lighthouse Cottage on a December evening, 4 years and 2 months after Marcus died. 4 months after the verdict, 1 month after Victoria started serving her sentence. The house was quiet around me, full of furniture I'd chosen and art I'd created and a life I'd built from absolute zero. It wasn't the life I'd planned. It wasn't even close to what I'd imagined that day Marcus and I had toasted to new beginnings. But it was mine, earned through stubbornness and legal strategy, and the refusal to accept someone else's version of my story. The lighthouse beacon rotated behind me, casting its light across dark water, a warning to ships about the rocks below. I'd been those rocks, dangerous and immovable, and eventually devastating to anyone who underestimated them. Now I was the light, showing others where the hazards were hidden, helping them navigate safely through their own dark waters. Victory, I'd learned, wasn't about restoration. It was about transformation. It was about taking everything that had been used to destroy you and forging it into tools for building something new. It was about looking at the wreckage of your life and deciding what to keep, what to release, and what to completely reimagine. Marcus would always be part of my foundation, the love and loss that had shaped everything that came after. But I wasn't building a memorial anymore. I was building a life, messy and imperfect and entirely my own, on ground I'd fought like hell to reclaim. The gray shutters were gone. The house was mine. And I was finally genuinely free. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning in late February, almost 5 months after the verdict. Plain white envelope, no return address, my name written in handwriting I recognized instantly even though I hadn't seen it in years. My mother's careful script, each letter perfectly formed like she was addressing a wedding invitation rather than reaching out to the daughter she'd helped her other daughter rob. I stood in my kitchen at Lighthouse Cottage holding that envelope like it might explode, debating whether to open it or throw it directly into the fireplace. Curiosity won out over self-preservation. Inside was a single card, expensive cardstock with embossed edges. Victoria was getting out early, the note explained, some combination of good behavior and overcrowding that meant her 18-month sentence had been reduced to 11 months with time served. There was going to be a small gathering, just family, to welcome her home and support her reintegration. The note said my presence would mean everything to Victoria, that she'd been doing a lot of reflection and growth during her time away, that maybe this could be an opportunity for healing and reconciliation. I read it 3 times, each reading making me angrier than the last. The audacity of asking me to celebrate Victoria's release, to participate in some fairy tale redemption arc where she got to be the reformed criminal, and I got to be the forgiving victim who made her transformation meaningful. The note made no mention of the theft, no acknowledgement of what had actually happened, just vague references to difficult times and family working through challenges together. It was signed by my mother, but I knew my father had been involved in crafting it. The language had his lawyer touch, carefully neutral phrasing that implied without stating, that suggested Victoria was a victim of circumstance rather than a perpetrator of deliberate fraud. I put the invitation in a drawer and tried to forget about it, but it gnawed at me for days. Not because I was tempted to go, but because I couldn't believe they still thought this was something that could be smoothed over with a family gathering and some inspirational talk about moving forward. Jenna came over that weekend and I showed her the invitation, watching her face cycle through disbelief, anger, and finally dark amusement. She asked if they were genuinely delusional, or just so committed to their narrative that they couldn't see reality anymore. I said probably both, that people who'd spent years lying to everyone including themselves couldn't suddenly flip a switch and become honest. She asked what I was going to do and I said nothing, absolutely nothing, because the opposite of love isn't hate, it's indifference. I'd spent 4 years of my life consumed by what my family had done to me, fighting to reclaim what they'd stolen, proving they'd committed crimes they tried to disguise as care. I wasn't going to spend another minute on their fantasy that we could all just move past it because Victoria had served some reduced sentence and claimed to have learned something. Jenna raised her wine glass in a toast to indifference, and we spent the rest of the evening talking about anything other than my family. but indifference turned out to be harder to maintain than I'd thought. Tyler called a few days later saying he'd gotten the same invitation, that the whole family was being mobilized to welcome Victoria home and pretend everything was fine. He said Uncle Greg had called him personally, using that jovial tone that suggested questioning the narrative was somehow rude or inappropriate. Tyler had asked directly what Victoria had done to make amends, what steps she'd taken beyond serving her legally mandated sentence. Uncle Greg had gotten defensive, said that dwelling on the past wasn't productive, that family forgives and moves forward. Tyler had told him he'd be skipping the celebration and suggested Uncle Greg ask himself why he was more comfortable with theft than accountability. Uncle Greg had hung up on him. Tyler sounded tired when he told me this story, exhausted by the effort of maintaining reality in a family that preferred comfortable fiction. He said he was thinking about changing his last name, completely disassociating from the Brooks legacy. I told him I understood the impulse but that he'd earned the right to keep his name by being the only one in the family who'd chosen integrity over convenience. The gathering was scheduled for a Saturday in March at my parents' new house in Arizona. I knew this because Aunt Diane had sent me a Facebook message, despite having unfriended me years ago, with details about travel arrangements and asking if I needed help booking flights. The message was cheerful and casual, like we'd just spoken yesterday, rather than her having publicly called me mentally unstable and prayed for my troubled soul on social media. I didn't respond to the message, but I did look up their new address, curious about where they'd landed after fleeing Ashford. It was a gated community outside Scottsdale, one of those developments where every house looked identical and the homeowners association regulated everything from mailbox color to acceptable window treatments. They'd gone from being prominent figures in a small coastal town to being anonymous in a sprawling suburb, which I supposed was the whole point. Reinvention required distance from anyone who remembered what you were running from. I tried to focus on work, on my new position at the legal aid nonprofit where I was helping people navigate exactly the kind of estate exploitation I'd experienced. The job was emotionally demanding, each case a reminder of my own trauma, but also deeply satisfying in a way my previous paralegal work had never been. I met with clients who'd lost homes to predatory reverse mortgages, who'd signed documents they didn't understand under pressure from family members, who discovered too late that power of attorney didn't mean what they'd thought it meant. I helped them file complaints, connected them with attorneys who'd work pro bono or on contingency, taught them how to read legal documents and recognize red flags. Some cases we won, some we lost, and some settled in that murky middle ground where the victim got something back but not everything, where justice was partial and incomplete. I started leading workshops at senior centers about estate planning and fraud prevention, standing in community rooms with linoleum floors and folding chairs, teaching people how to protect themselves from the kind of theft my own family had perfected. One of my clients was a woman named Dorothy whose son had somehow gotten control of her house through a quitclaim deed she didn't remember signing. She was in her 80s, sharp as ever mentally but physically frail, and she sat in my office with a folder of documents and a story that sounded horrifyingly familiar. Her son had offered to help her with paperwork after her husband died. She'd been overwhelmed and grateful. She'd signed things he put in front of her, trusting that he had her best interests at heart. 6 months later she'd received an eviction notice from her own home because her son had sold the property, and the new owners wanted her out. She'd come to me after seeing a news article about my case, hoping that if I'd fought my family and won, maybe she could too. We filed suit immediately, arguing the quitclaim deed had been obtained through fraud and undue influence. The case was still working through the system, but we'd gotten a temporary restraining order preventing the eviction, buying time to build our case. Dorothy reminded me of myself in those early days after Marcus died, trying to make sense of betrayal by people who were supposed to love you unconditionally. The week before Victoria's welcome home celebration, my mother called. I almost didn't answer, had my finger hovering over the decline button, but some combination of curiosity and residual childhood training made me pick up. Her voice sounded older, thinner, like the past 4 years had aged her faster than time should allow. She asked how I was doing in that careful tone people use when they're not sure if they're allowed to ask. I said I was fine, keeping my voice neutral and uninformative. She said she'd hoped I received the invitation, that it would mean so much to Victoria if I came. I let the silence stretch out, waiting to see if she'd acknowledge anything real, or if we were going to pretend this was just a normal family rift over something trivial. She filled the silence with more careful words about healing and moving forward and how family was the most important thing. I finally interrupted and asked if she was calling to apologize or just to recruit me for Victoria's Redemption Theater. The question seemed to catch her off guard. She said she knew I was angry, that I had a right to my feelings, but that holding on to resentment was only hurting me. She said Victoria had paid her debt to society and deserved a chance to rebuild her life. She said families went through difficult times and came out stronger on the other side. She said all of this like she was reading from a script, hitting the expected marks without genuine emotion behind them. I asked her directly if she believed Victoria had stolen from me, or if she still thought it had been some misguided attempt to help. Long pause, the kind that tells you everything you need to know. She finally said that the situation had been complicated, that there had been mistakes on both sides, that fixating on blame wasn't productive. I laughed, couldn't help it, the sound bitter even to my own ears. I told her there hadn't been mistakes on both sides. There had been deliberate theft on one side and justified anger on the other. I told her that Victoria hadn't paid her debt to me, only her debt to the legal system, and those weren't the same thing. I told her that I'd rebuilt my life without any of them, and it turned out I didn't need their version of family at all. She was quiet for a moment, then her voice got harder, more like the mother I actually remembered instead of this careful stranger. She said I'd always been stubborn, always thought I knew better than everyone else, always made things more difficult than they needed to be. She said my father had been trying to protect me and I'd repaid him by destroying his career. She said Victoria had made a mistake, but I'd made sure she suffered for it excessively. She said I should think carefully about whether maintaining this grudge was worth permanent estrangement from my entire family. The mask had slipped and underneath was the same woman who'd sat silently while my father validated every lie Victoria told, who'd blocked my number and let me believe I was crazy, who'd chosen the daughter who fit their image over the daughter who needed them. I told her the estrangement wasn't my choice, it was theirs made. For years ago when they locked me out and rewrote history to erase me. I told her I'd think very carefully about her words and my answer was still no. Then I hung up before she could respond, my hands shaking with adrenaline and old anger I'd thought I'd processed. I called Tyler immediately after, needing to talk to someone who'd understand. He'd gotten a similar call from Dad. Same script about family unity and moving forward. Same implication that Tyler's refusal to participate made him the problem rather than Victoria's theft being the problem. Tyler had told Dad that he'd consider attending if Victoria made direct personal amends to me first, including full acknowledgement of what she'd done and why it was wrong. Dad had said that was setting unrealistic conditions, that I was too angry to accept any apology right now anyway, that they needed to move forward as a family without waiting for me to be ready. Tyler had pointed out that moving forward without addressing what happened was just rug sweeping, and Dad had accused him of being influenced by my bitterness. We talked for over an hour, both of us processing the realization that our family hadn't changed at all. They'd just temporarily been forced to face consequences, and now that Victoria was getting out, they were reverting to their default setting of protecting her and scapegoating anyone who wouldn't play along. The day of Victoria's celebration came and went. I spent it painting in my studio, working on a series I'd started about reconstruction and transformation. The paintings were abstract but recognizable. Buildings being torn down and rebuilt with their own rubble, phoenixes made of ash and bone, broken pottery reassembled with gold seams that made the cracks part of the design rather than flaws to hide. The Japanese called it kintsugi, treating damage as part of an object's history, rather than something to disguise. That philosophy had become central to how I thought about my own life. I wasn't trying to get back to who I'd been before Marcus died, before my family betrayed me. That person was gone, broken beyond repair. Instead, I was building someone new from the pieces, and the cracks where I'd been shattered were now the most interesting parts. The gold that filled them was made of every small victory, every moment I'd chosen to keep going when giving up seemed easier, every person who'd shown me that love could be unconditional and trust could be earned rather than assumed. Jenna came over that evening with Thai food and terrible reality television, her usual prescription for difficult days. We ate on the porch even though it was cold, wrapped in blankets and watching the lighthouse beam rotate. She asked how I felt knowing Victoria was out, knowing there'd been a party I hadn't attended, knowing my family was probably talking about my absence in whispered conversations full of disappointment and judgment. I said I felt relieved, actually, that the final test of whether they'd changed had definitively answered itself. I'd wondered if prison would humble Victoria, if consequences would force any of them to genuinely examine their actions. Now I knew it hadn't. She'd served her reduced sentence and they'd welcomed her home as a victim of circumstance rather than an architect of fraud. My absence from that narrative was its own form of freedom. I didn't have to participate in their delusion anymore. I didn't have to manage their feelings or make myself smaller to fit their preferred version of events. I could just exist over here in my life they tried to destroy, thriving in ways that had nothing to do with them. Work became my primary focus after that, throwing myself into cases with the kind of intensity that worried Jenna but kept me from dwelling on family drama I couldn't control. Dorothy's case went to court in April and we won a preliminary ruling that the quitclaim deed had been obtained through fraud, that her son had exploited her grief and vulnerability for financial gain. The judge ordered the property transfer reversed and awarded Dorothy damages for the emotional distress of nearly being evicted from her own home. Her son had looked shocked when the verdict was read, like he genuinely believed he'd done nothing wrong, like helping himself to his mother's house had been a reasonable response to her needing help. Dorothy cried in the hallway afterward, kept hugging me and thanking me for believing her when her own family had called her confused and ungrateful. I told her she'd done the hard part by refusing to accept their version of reality, by fighting back when fighting seemed hopeless. She said I'd taught her that reading about my case had given her the courage to pursue her own. That exchange, that moment of my pain becoming someone else's roadmap through their own trauma, justified every difficult hour of the past 4 years. The book I'd been writing about estate fraud and family exploitation found a publisher in May, a small press that specialized in legal narratives and social justice issues. They wanted to publish it in early fall, timing it to coincide with estate planning season when people were thinking about wills and trusts and end-of-life arrangements. The editor assigned to my project was a woman named Rachel who'd gone through her own family estrangement after calling out her parents' financial abuse. She understood the story from the inside, knew how complicated it was to tell the truth about people you'd loved, how difficult it was to maintain boundaries when society insisted family should always reconcile. We worked together to shape my rough manuscript into something cohesive, expanding the legal analysis sections while keeping the personal narrative that made the issues accessible. She pushed me to be more honest about my anger, to stop hedging and apologizing and trying to seem reasonable to hypothetical readers who might judge me for not forgiving my family. She said the readers who needed this book would be the ones who understood that some betrayals don't deserve forgiveness, that sometimes the healthiest choice is permanent distance. The title we settled on was The Theft of Trust: How Families Exploit Grief and What We Can Do About It. Rachel thought it was perfect, direct and clear about the book's content, while hinting at the emotional complexity underneath. We sent advance copies to legal professionals, victim advocates, and journalists who covered white-collar crime. The early responses were encouraging, people saying it filled a gap in existing literature about estate fraud, that most books focused on stranger danger while family exploitation was far more common and far more devastating. Several law schools requested copies for their elder law and ethics courses. A victims' rights organization wanted to use excerpts in their training materials. Mr. Pemberton wrote the foreword, a succinct explanation of how estate fraud works and why cases like mine were important for establishing precedent. He said in decades of practicing law he'd never seen someone fight as effectively as I had with as few resources, that my stubbornness had been the deciding factor in victory. I appreciated the compliment, but I knew it wasn't just stubbornness. It was rage channeled into productive action, grief transformed into determination, and the knowledge that staying silent would mean Victoria won twice. Tyler drove down from Seattle for the 4th of July weekend, and we spent it at Lighthouse Cottage doing nothing particularly ambitious. We grilled burgers on the new deck I'd had built, drank beer and watched fireworks over the bay from boats and neighboring properties, talked about everything and nothing. He'd graduated with his master's degree and been offered a position at a tech company in Portland, thinking about relocating to be closer to the coast. I told him he could stay with me while he looked for apartments, that I had guest rooms now and he was always welcome. He said our family would lose their minds if they found out he was living with me, that it would be seen as choosing sides. I said he'd already chosen sides by being the only one who told the truth when lying would have been easier. He asked if I ever missed them, not who they'd become but who I'd thought they were before everything fell apart. I said sometimes I mourned the family I'd imagined I had, the people I'd believed cared about me unconditionally. But I didn't miss the actual people who'd proven their love came with terms and conditions I'd never agreed to. The book launched in September with a small reading at a Portland bookstore that specialized in social justice and activist literature. I'd been nervous about reading excerpts out loud, about standing in front of strangers and talking about the worst period of my life. But the room was full of people who'd experienced similar betrayals, who nodded along as I read about grief being weaponized and family becoming predator. During the Q&A section afterward, person after person stood up and shared their own stories of estate theft, of trusts manipulated and properties stolen and inheritances diverted. Some had fought back and won. Some had fought back and lost. Some were still deciding whether fighting was worth the cost. I couldn't offer easy answers or guarantee justice, but I could tell them they weren't crazy. Their families had genuinely stolen from them, and speaking truth to power was worthwhile even when power didn't listen. A reporter from the local paper was there taking notes, and the article that ran the next week included quotes from attendees about how the book had validated their experiences and given them language for what had happened to them. Victoria reached out directly for the first time in October, an email that bypassed my blocked phone number. The subject line was an attempt at conversation, which already annoyed me with its careful neutrality. The email itself was long and meandering, full of therapy language about taking accountability and doing the work and understanding her role in my pain. She said her time in jail had given her space to reflect on her choices and their consequences. She said she understood now that she'd prioritized her own ambition and greed over my well-being, that she'd exploited my grief in ways that were inexcusable regardless of her intentions. She said she'd been in counseling working through her issues with competition and inadequacy, that she'd always felt like she had to be the successful one to earn Dad's approval, that she'd resented my freedom to pursue art while she felt trapped by family expectations to follow them into law. She said none of that justified what she'd done, but it helped explain how she'd convinced herself it wasn't really theft, just temporary management of assets I couldn't handle. She said she didn't expect forgiveness but wanted me to know she was genuinely sorry and was committed to making amends however I deemed appropriate. I read the email 3 times, analyzing it the way I'd learned to analyze legal documents, looking for what was unsaid and what was being carefully worded to avoid liability. The apology was better than I'd expected, more specific and less self-serving than the usual "I'm sorry if you were hurt" non-apologies people offered. But it still centered her growth and her therapy and her journey toward becoming a better person, with my suffering mainly serving as the catalyst for her transformation. There was no mention of the specific damage she'd caused, the 3 years I'd spent working multiple jobs and sleeping on air mattresses, the opportunities I'd lost because I'd been fighting for survival instead of building my career. There was no acknowledgement that her apology meant less than nothing if it didn't come with concrete reparations beyond what the court had mandated. I drafted several responses, each one progressively more honest and less polite. The first thanked her for reaching out but said I wasn't ready to engage. The second listed specific harms and asked what she'd done to make restitution. The third told her that personal growth at my expense didn't impress me, that she should feel proud of her therapy breakthroughs without requiring my validation. I sent none of them. Instead, I saved the email to a folder and closed my laptop. She didn't deserve my emotional labor or my time spent crafting the perfect response. She'd said her piece and I'd heard it, and that was where our interaction could end. The holidays approached with their usual complicated emotions multiplied by 4 years of estrangement. I'd spent previous Thanksgivings and Christmases with Jenna's family or Tyler or alone by choice, deliberately avoiding the period when family pressure to reconcile was strongest. This year Jenna invited me to her parents' house in Eugene for Thanksgiving, and I accepted even though meeting her family felt oddly formal after years of friendship. Her parents were warm and welcoming in the effortless way people who've never had to question family bonds can be. Her mother kept feeding me seconds and thirds, insisting I looked too thin and needed fattening up. Her father asked about my work with genuine interest, wanted to know how estate law worked, and what warning signs people should watch for. Her younger brother, home from college, asked me questions about the trial that Jenna quickly shut down, protective of my boundaries even when I hadn't asked her to be. It was pleasant and comfortable, and also highlighted how fundamentally different Jenna's family was from mine. They actually liked each other. They chose to spend time together rather than forcing togetherness out of obligation. They'd weathered their own difficulties but hadn't turned on each other when things got hard. I spent Christmas at Lighthouse Cottage, just me and the ocean and a stack of books I'd been meaning to read. Tyler had flown to visit his girlfriend's family in Chicago, and Jenna was working holiday shifts at the hospital. I could have been lonely but instead found the solitude restorative. I walked on the beach in the mornings when it was cold enough that I had it to myself. I cooked elaborate meals just for me, recipes that took hours and created more dishes than seemed reasonable for one person. I painted in my studio until my hands cramped and my eyes blurred. I video called with Tyler and Jenna, brief check-ins that confirmed we were all fine and didn't need rescue from our various solitary celebrations. On Christmas evening I received a package, no return address but postmarked from Scottsdale. Inside was a framed photo of my family from before everything fell apart, me and Victoria and our parents at some beach vacation I barely remembered. There was no note, no explanation, just the photo that was clearly meant to remind me of better times and make me nostalgic for what we'd lost. I looked at it for a long time, at my younger self smiling genuinely, at Victoria with her arm around my shoulders, at parents who looked proud of both daughters. Then I put the frame in a closet and forgot about it. That family, those people in the photograph, didn't exist anymore. Maybe they never had. The new year brought new opportunities and old ghosts. My book had sold well enough that the publisher wanted a follow-up. Either a deeper dive into legal remedies for estate fraud or a more personal memoir about family estrangement and recovery. I was leaning toward the legal focus, feeling like I'd already shared as much personal narrative as I wanted to make public. Rachel suggested I could do both, weave together case studies of other families with my own continued journey, show readers that recovery wasn't linear or complete but ongoing. I agreed to think about it, to start collecting stories and see what shape they wanted to take. Meanwhile, Dorothy had become a volunteer for my fraud prevention workshops, sharing her story with other seniors and helping them recognize the warning signs she'd missed. She said helping others process their family betrayals helped her process her own, that witnessing their courage gave her permission to maintain boundaries with her son despite pressure from extended family to reconcile. We'd become friends in an unexpected way, bonded by our shared experience of having family weaponize our grief against us. March brought the one-year anniversary of Victoria's release from jail, and simultaneously the publication of a long investigative piece about Brooks and Associates in a legal journal. The article detailed the full scope of my father's practice, interviewing former clients and examining cases going back 15 years. The pattern was undeniable and disturbing. Dozens of people who'd come to Brooks and Associates for estate planning help had somehow ended up with arrangements that primarily benefited the firm's associates and family friends. The article positioned my case as the one that finally broke the pattern of silence, but it made clear I was far from the only victim. My father declined to comment for the article beyond a statement from his attorney saying he'd made errors in judgment, but had never acted with malicious intent. The statement rang hollow against the evidence of systematic exploitation laid out across 12 pages of detailed reporting. I read the article in my studio, highlighter in hand like I was back in paralegal courses, marking the sections that surprised me with new information. There were cases I'd never heard about, people whose names I didn't recognize, schemes that made my own experience look almost simple by comparison. Tyler sent me the article with a message saying he was officially changing his last name, that he couldn't carry Brooks anymore knowing what it represented. He asked what I thought about taking Marcus's last name, honoring him by becoming Natalie Hartwell instead of Natalie Brooks. I'd never considered it, had kept Brooks through everything partly out of spite and partly because changing names felt like running. But Tyler's question made me reconsider. What was I holding on to by keeping a name associated with people who tried to destroy me? Marcus and I had never discussed name changes during our marriage, had both kept our original names out of habit more than philosophy. But taking his name now, 5 years after his death, felt like a different kind of memorial than the house had been. It was choosing to carry his memory forward in a way that honored him without requiring me to preserve everything exactly as it had been. I started the legal process that week, filing the paperwork and paying the fees and imagining signing documents as Natalie Hartwell instead of Natalie Brooks. The name felt both strange and right, like putting on a coat that didn't quite fit yet but would with time. The final piece of closure I hadn't expected came in April when Mr. Pemberton called saying my father wanted to meet. Not to apologize apparently, but to discuss something important that he'd only share in person. Mr. Pemberton advised against it, said there was no legal requirement for me to engage, and given our history there was significant risk that any meeting would be emotionally manipulative. But I was curious despite myself, wondering what could possibly be important enough for my father to reach out after more than a year of silence. I agreed to meet in Mr. Pemberton's office with him present, neutral ground with witness protection. My father arrived looking older than I remembered, his hair fully gray now, his shoulders stooped like he'd been carrying weight that had finally become too heavy. He sat across from me in the conference room and didn't make small talk, just launched into what he'd come to say. He'd been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's, progressive and incurable, though treatment could slow the decline. He had maybe 5 to 10 years before he wouldn't recognize anyone or remember his own history. He said he was telling me because he wanted me to understand he hadn't been in his right mind during the property transfer, that even back then he'd been experiencing cognitive decline that had affected his judgment. It was a brilliant defense strategy, blame the disease rather than take accountability for deliberate choices. I asked when he'd been diagnosed and he admitted it was recent, within the past 6 months, though he claimed symptoms had been present for years. I asked if he was suggesting he'd committed fraud against me because of undiagnosed Alzheimer's, and he said it was more complicated than that he'd always had difficulty seeing me clearly because I reminded him too much of his own father who'd been an impractical dreamer. He'd wanted better for me than his father had achieved, had thought pushing me toward practical choices was protecting me, had genuinely believed Victoria's management of the property was in my best interest even if the methods were questionable. None of this was an apology, just an explanation that centered his experience and his intentions while treating my suffering as an unfortunate side effect of his protective impulses gone wrong. I listened to all of it without interrupting, watching Mr. Pemberton take notes in case any of this became legally relevant later. When my father finished his monologue and looked at me expectantly, waiting for forgiveness or absolution or whatever he'd come to receive, I asked him one question. Did he actually regret what he'd done to me, or did he just regret getting caught? He looked genuinely taken aback, like the question had never occurred to him. He said he regretted that I'd been hurt, that the situation had escalated the way it had, that our family had been torn apart. But when I pressed specifically about whether he regretted facilitating Victoria's theft of my property, whether he'd do anything differently if he could go back, he couldn't give me a straight answer. He talked around it, mentioned difficult choices and complex circumstances and trying to do what was best for everyone. I stood up then, thanked him for the information about his diagnosis, and told him I hoped he found peace with his condition. I didn't wish him suffering, didn't hope the disease would be particularly cruel, but I also wasn't going to pretend his approaching mortality obligated me to forgive him for what he'd done while he still had full cognitive function. He asked if this was really how I wanted to leave things, if I could live with permanent estrangement knowing he might not remember me in a few years. I told him I'd already been living with permanent estrangement for 5 years, that I'd grieved the family I thought I had and built a new life without them, that his diagnosis changed nothing about the fundamental facts of what he'd done. Mr. Pemberton walked me out while my father sat in the conference room looking smaller and older, and somehow still not quite grasping that accountability meant more than explanations. In the parking lot I sat in my car for 20 minutes just breathing, processing the complicated emotions of learning your estranged parent has a terminal diagnosis. I didn't feel vindicated or sad or much of anything beyond a distant compassion for anyone facing that particular decline. But I didn't feel obligated to reconnect or provide comfort or any of the things society insisted children owed even abusive parents. He'd made his choices and I'd made mine, and disease didn't erase the past or require reconciliation in the present. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.